I need to say a word or two in light of the fact that there is what we will talk about, an industrial strength campaign to censor this story, and I need to say something rather directly to those who are most likely to attempt to censor it. What I want to say is that Dr. Kory is not only an advocate for a therapy that is incredibly useful in the context of COVID-19, but he is also someone who has pioneered therapies already that are now the standard of care for COVID-19 patients. That means he has earned the right to talk about whatever he thinks is important. For my part, as you know, I was also very early on the lab leak hypothesis, and I was very careful about how I presented it. And of course, in the last month, that hypothesis has been vindicated. Everyone, including Dr. Ralph Baric, who is the leading expert in the world on bat-borne coronaviruses and their modification in the lab, has acknowledged that a leak from the lab in Wuhan, China, is plausible. I have also earned the right to talk about what I want to talk about and what I think is necessary. We are now going to have a conversation, and if you don't like it, that, YouTube, is your problem. We are entitled to discuss this because a lot depends on it. And what we do when issues are complex is we hash them out and figure out what's true through dialectic. So that's what we're going to do. The cost for a treatment of ivermectin is
negligible.
It's like I've seen the range from $3 to $12.
Yeah.
Right? $3 to $12. Yeah. For remdesivir, a new drug still very much under patent, still very much paying the bills for its development, $3,000 a treatment?
$3,000.
Okay, so that might begin to point in the direction of that object with immense gravity that is acting against distribution of simple information about the effectiveness of ivermectin, right?
There's no question. And that, again, going back to the problem, you know, when you look at what is being recommended to treat this disease, it's deplorable. There's not a lot of consistency on how they made recommendations. Like, the evidence for remdesivir is completely suspect. It's very weak, and it's not even consistent. The WHO doesn't recommend it. The NIH does, right? And they're giving an antiviral in the hospital. Days and days and days into an illness. The one thing we know about antivirals is they're really only effective when you give it upon first symptoms. So We're spending $3,000 a dose on a drug day 8 or 9 into an illness. Like, the return on that is abysmal. It's not a very effective drug, but yet that is our standard of care in this country. And so that problem is they're artificially limiting, and how they arrive at these treatment recommendations are absurd. And it's clear it's because we are vulnerable. Our system is vulnerable. It's a system where the voices that get heard are those with lots of money behind them. Those shiny trials that they put forth, those are the ones that get listened to. And those are the ones that get recommended. So we're in a system where we're completely beholden to those with financial interest. A little drug like ivermectin, which has it's off patent. It's manufactured throughout the world. No one's making money off of it. That doesn't get heard. There's no voice. There's no force that is in the halls of the NIH or that can put forth that. Now that's the kindest description of what I think is going on with ivermectin. Certainly, it doesn't have a proponent, but then we also can talk. It has opponents.
It has no proponent.
So a lack of a proponent, and it's up against the deepest and the most powerful opponents that you can imagine.
All of them. I mean, you can't go up against the officialdom of the WHO and the CDC with the backing of every social media platform. You know, if Silicon Valley lines up with the halls of government against a treatment, it's the battle is so Herculean, it's almost unimaginable.
I mean, the YouTube, the censorship is their weapon. They're not the opponent, right? It's how they're fighting against ivermectin. But the opponents, again, I don't like talking about it, but I wrote a white paper. It's on our website, which is getting a lot of attention, and I basically list the opposition. You know, those that would lose financially by ivermectin becoming the standard of care, right? Mm-hmm. Number one is the entire global vaccination policy would be kneecapped, right? The EUAs would probably be revoked if you had an effective, preventive, as well as treatment option.
If the rules by which they were granted were enforced.
That's a better way to say it.
Yes. So no guarantee that would happen given the kind of power arrayed against these things. But
naive again? Is that what you're calling me?
That's what happened. Yeah. Right. But so they never would have been granted in the first place. And they would have to be revoked now, and for very good reason.
Yep.
Right? So
if the rules that they laid out were enforced,
right.
I definitely have to remember to say that, because you're right. It would not necessarily happen.
Right. So the rules, just so the listeners can follow along, the rules say that you can't grant this unusual authorization because of the hazard that it carries with it, if there is a safe and effective treatment available.
Correct.
So if there are two things that the ivermectin treatment appears to be, it's safe and effective, right? Not only safe and effective, but a prophylactic, right? So it does a job that the vaccines do, right? So there is no basis to grant the emergency use authorization. And I would also point out, as long as we're here, that there is something so bizarre about the fact that the challenge to ivermectin is not that it is a terrible drug. It is that the evidence for it is not strong enough, right? Now,
that's what they claim.
Right. I think this is bullshit.
Of course it's bullshit.
Even if it was true, right? The emergency use authorization effectively allows vaccines a very low standard that they have to meet because this is an emergency and we have to get them out immediately.
Yeah, the bar was set a little bit low, Brett. Is that what you're saying?
Set very
for the vaccine,
low.
So they could leap over and become massively used and distributed throughout the world. Yeah.
Right. And they are a marvel, I must say, technologically speaking. But at the same time, you're setting the bar for them exceedingly low because this is an emergency. In the very same emergency, setting the bar incredibly high, in fact, impossibly high, for a drug that is already well known to be safe, and therefore the risks of actually taking a gamble on it are very small, right? It is inconsistent, at the very least, to apply the low standard to the one and the high standard to the other. And if you were going to do it, if you were going to have a double standard, it should go the other way, because ivermectin, the risk of harming a patient with it is so low, whereas we don't know, at a long-term level, we do not know what happens with the vaccines.
I'm picturing the imagery that's coming to mind is like the giants of the vaccine industry stepping over like a little bar, you know, and then there's like little ivermectin who's like trying to leap up and, you know,
right.
I mean, literally, but who's setting that system? Like, I mean, that's the question. I mean, they're setting the bar here and here. There's got to be a reason behind it.
Well, there is. And I always am cautious in this place in a conversation, because we can detect that there's a gargantuan, something that is exerting gargantuan force in this space. And we can infer that it has something to do with the financial incentives surrounding remdesivir, for example, the vaccine campaign.
All the pipeline molecules, the stuff that's coming that they want to bring to market,
all
are
of these
also
things,
there,
which have had a tremendous investment made in them.
Yep.
So the thing that I think we are almost certain to get wrong is that as outsiders, we have no idea what these conversations sound like on the inside, right? And there is a temptation to imagine that people are somehow sitting around comfortable with the fact that their behavior is going to cause hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of deaths, that it may stick humanity with a relationship with a pathogen that it will not be able to shake because it will prevent us from taking the appropriate action until it's too late. We imagine that people are saying these things out loud when I'm sure that there are some sociopaths in the system who are probably capable of having those discussions, but there aren't enough sociopaths to account for this behavior.
Right.
So there is some way that people who are doing a harm great enough, I have called it the crime of the century, and I realize the century is young, but this is going to be hard to top.
This is hard to top.
It's going to be hard to top. So there's some way that people who are engaged in something worthy of a claim like crime of the century are comfortable with what they are doing, or worse, are convinced that it is the right thing, that somehow the greater good is being served?
Well, I do think that there's some sociopaths that are exerting this. I mean, or just they're able to see. So here's the most sort of magnanimous I can be. Is I definitely see intellectual laziness is driving this. So some of this is benign neglect, much of it occurring across the profession of medicine. So a lot of doctors are just parroting what they're told, is that the evidence is insufficient, poor trials, small, and nobody's critically looking at it. So, and even public health agencies, I think, are also guilty of that, of not exerting and spending the resources that they should critically examining this. That's the kindest I can be, right? But I also think that there are forces. So for instance, what I believe that happened at the WHO is I believe that committee was told had to do the most recent review on Ivermectin. They were basically told that they can't come out of that room with a recommendation for Ivermectin. And let's say the motivation, so that the most sinister would be at great cost of lives so people could make money. That would be a very sinister one.
Yeah.
A much more one that I think you could almost argue might be reasonable is that I do think there are people who are so convinced that vaccines are the answer to this, and that goal needs to be achieved at all costs, which is mass vaccination, and they see ivermectin as disrupting that. So maybe they have some sort of greater public health goal, and that is how they rationalize what they're doing. So that's the kindest I can be. That's the kindest I can be. That they're doing it with good intention.
Right.
The road to
they do, but they are doing without logic. Right. And
clearly.
so Heather and I have been making the point on the DarkHorse live streams that the goal of getting, to the extent that one is a believer in the vaccines, believes that they are very, very safe, that there will not be long-term harms, that the key is to get so many people vaccinated that COVID goes extinct, right?
Yep.
I believe people really think that.
I do too.
And I don't think that they're worried enough about what we don't know about the long term. And
Agreed.
frankly, I don't think they're worried enough about what shows up with respect to short-term stuff. But let's just say that was their perspective. They are not thinking well, because what one needs in order to defeat COVID is lots and lots of people who are not susceptible to it. True. And there are really three categories of people who are not susceptible to it, right? There are people who have taken the vaccine who are highly protected, though not from variants. Right, for now. There are people who have had COVID who appear to be as protected as people who have had the vaccine, as I understand the evidence, and people on ivermectin.
Yep.
Right? All you need is for those three groups to add up to herd immunity in order for COVID to go extinct. So to the extent that people are having the sense that they are the good people because they are pushing the vaccine thing so hard that everybody will have to get it and they will strong arm us if they must, right? Those people are not understanding that the goal, which is laudable, which is herd immunity, can be achieved with a composite of types of immunity.
Yep.
And I will also say there are two facts about the way we deal with COVID that to me stand out like a sore thumb. They tell me that this is not about good medical advice, right?
Okay.
That something is about something more important than good medical advice. One of them is that we are insisting that people who have had COVID get the vaccine, right? Now, to me, I'm focused on the fact that I know very well we cannot know anything about the long-term consequences, and I know that the human immune system is a complex one, and that interfacing with it potentially has consequences that will surprise us, and that we will not know for decades what the effect of this thing is, and that these technologies have only existed for less than a year. So we cannot possibly imagine ourselves experts in terms of the long-term impact of these vaccines. So to take people...
That is very disturbing. I just want to emphasize that point you just made. The fact that that they're insisting that everyone get vaccinated, whether you've had it or not, it's extremely disturbing.
So you've got some...
Because it's all downside. You're only exposing them to the risks of the vaccine without the benefits. And so how can you credibly do that? The doctors that I know and trust, in fact, in our group, one of the doctors who helped us form, Dr. Keith Berkowitz, he's an internist in Manhattan. He does not allow his patients to get vaccinated unless they've been tested for antibodies. If they have antibodies, he tells them not to get vaccinated.
This makes...
That's good medicine.
Right. No, it makes no sense. You have to imagine that the long-term downsides are inherently zero in order to even justify the stupidity of vaccinating. I mean, you don't even have enough vaccine. If your idea was to vaccinate everybody, you should at least economize on the vaccine, even if the long-term risks were zero.
You're again making too much sense.
Yeah, sorry about that.
I mean, it's and you can. I mean, we could go all day on all of those areas where things just don't, just on the face of it, just on paper, make very little sense. And then we all know about antibody enhancement. So when you give, and that's been known for coronavirus vaccine attempts in history, that if you give it to those who've gotten it before, they get the sickest. And so I think people are getting harmed without a more sensible approach to this. Yeah.
So a medical system that claims to be analyzing the evidence and figuring out what's best, and then is acting in an authoritarian fashion and telling doctors what to do when, I'm not a doctor. I can figure out they're screwing this up, right? That tells you that this is about something else. The other thing that tells you that this is about something else, I think, is this policy that we don't treat you until you need help, right? Until you're in dire straits. The idea of sending people with COVID home and then seeing if they get sick enough.
Till they turn blue.
Right. But the point is, if your point, and I think it should be all of our point, if your point is really actually let us end the pandemic at any reasonable cost, right? If that's the point, sending people home is propagating the pandemic, and treating them late when you have a drug that would fix them early is malpractice.
The only way in which that's sensible, Brett, is the studies using ivermectin as prevention. So there was two types of study designs. One, where they prophylaxed healthcare workers. The other, which I thought was brilliant, is that anyone who tested positive, they immediately gave ivermectin to the household. And they found in the households that took ivermectin, you could protect the household to a great extent. Now, the studies weren't perfect because by the time you got them ivermectin, they had already been around their sick household members. So you can't prevent everything, but you could prevent that further risk of sending them home. So you can send them home safely.
Right. So, okay, if you had that,
you could do it safely.
If you had the committee of clinicians figuring out what have we learned in the last week, and coming up with the update to standard of care every week based on what we actually know, you could do something like that. But what we're doing now, sending people home to get their relatives sick and then treating them only when it's become an emergency, and they're not making that much virus at that point anyway, this is preposterous and insane. And those two things together just stand out. We are obviously willing to have many, many people die in order to accomplish some goal that has not been shared with us publicly.
It's an obsessive focus with vaccines. And the other thing that I want to say about ivermectin is that the real shame, I mean, that's an understatement, but we think of ivermectin, we need more than just vaccines. Even if the vaccines prove to be safe and long-term effective, you still need more, right? Because I like your model is that to really control the pandemic, you either need herd immunity by vaccination, prior exposure, or with ivermectin. Now, somehow you got to get to whatever that number is, 90, 80, percent. We think of ivermectin as that bridge. So it's not only a bridge to vaccine. So for all of the areas of the world which are not going to see a vaccine for a year or two, there's just not enough, right? For all of those who are vaccine hesitant, you could safely or contraindicate. There are people who can't get the vaccines. They can now live safely with an alternative medicine. So you could treat the vaccine hesitant, the vaccine contraindicated, or the vaccine poor, meaning those that won't get vaccines. And so it's another tool in the toolbox. We need more than just, one horse to win this battle, right?
And we are hobbling, to the extent that the vaccine effort is an effort to get to herd immunity, we are hobbling that effort by demonizing ivermectin.
There's no question.